In 1953, in the years of Stephen Penrose being the president, he wrote the history of AUB, but he really thought that it would be much more complete with art courses. Already there had been some interest in art. Both Amr al-Ansi and Mustafa Farrukh had been connected to AUB. One of them even had the first art exhibition that was ever held in AUB, and people had been interested. AUB at that time had connections with the Chicago Art Institute, which was important in those days. So he contacted them, and they found for him a teacher willing to come over here. Her name was Mariette Charlton, and she brought with her a couple, both of whom were artists. They were married, Margot Hoff and Professor Bruin, I forget his first name. Now, we're talking about 1954 she arrived. The art classes that those three set up were very popular. Students enrolled. They also did extracurricular activities. They had seminars for children. I was one of them. They mounted exhibitions, and in the exhibitions they showed off art that was quite different from what was going on in the Lebanese scene. The exhibitions attracted a lot of attention in the press, but also in society, and especially when Lebanon's First Lady, Zalfa Shamhoun, started attending. She wanted to encourage arts herself. So she even supported the art seminars by posing for the older people as they painted portraits. She sat there for hours, and some of the portraits were really quite good, but they were being painted by amateurs, and so it was very kind of her to give that kind of time. Because she gave this kind of attention, and also because of the press, AUB had quite a high profile. Many people were very interested in what was going on in AUB culturally. Now, those three that I mentioned, they didn't exactly set up a program. They set up a group of art courses that were electives. But then Mariette went out scouting for the kind of teachers who could set up a program. The person that she found, and she was assisted by Margot Hoff, her second in command, they found Arthur Frick. He actually originated the program as a program that could allow students to then receive a BA degree in fine arts, which was the thing that I did as well. Arthur Frick stayed here and was the chairman for 10 years out of the 20 years that he was here. He was assisted by Professor John Carswell, who had been enlisted by Mariette Charlton also. She had seen him in one of the archaeological digs that were going on in Lebanon, and he was the artist who was supposed to record artifacts. He actually went on to be the Islamic arts expert in Sotheby's in London while in Lebanon. He mounted an exhibition of the man who painted huge pictures of movie stars that would go onto the front of the Rivoli Theatre every week. A new picture, huge, of Jane Russell or Marilyn Monroe or whoever was the star of the movie for that week. So he was a good painter, and he would do this every week on panels that would cover 2 floors of the Rivoli Theatre, which was the largest in Lebanon at the time.
Hakat eir, gabuit koknot, yerb modetza, tun heratzar, inchu, tun pargatzar, edzevetza,
In the early days, Mariette Charlton was very good friends with Henri Seyrig, who was a French millionaire who loved art, had his own collection, which included Picasso's, Matisse's, and other really notable artists. And he made his collection open to viewing, and he especially liked the AUB activities that were going on, the seminars that I talked about. So they also brought in world-famous artists to give lectures, like Henry Moore, the English sculptor, like John Ferren, this was a little bit later, who had a residency here by the courtesy of the United States Information Service. Alexander Calder, the famous maker of mobiles, was a guest of Henri Seydigs, and he came and he gave a lecture about how he created art, and in the AUB they mounted an exhibition of his works and pictures of his works, and he also sculptured a huge, big, wonderful mobile that hung up in the Pan American offices opposite the Capitol Hotel in the Seyed Riyad al-Salah. Henry Moore gave a lecture about his work. John Ferren, whom I mentioned before, gave a lecture about his work that people found amazing because it was so different. His art was so different, and they looked at his art and you would see broad brushstrokes doing waves, a sun painted with lots of fat paint that stood out from the canvas, and his thinking was so different from what had gone on before. At first, people didn't know what to make of it. But then they decided, okay, this is modern art. We must think about that. And it encouraged many of the Lebanese artists who were thinking about expressionism, abstract art. It encouraged them to be free, to try that sort of idiom. Besides Ferren, we had a couple called the Montmagny. Pierre Montmagny and his wife Tracy were both highly successful in America. Helen Khal had quite a success in the Lebanese society with her pictures. Well, she taught, but she also had been here practicing. She joined AUB, and she was a writer as well. She would do the reviews of other people's art. But her own art was collected by King Hussein of Jordan, who wanted her to paint his portrait, and other notables as well. The AUB, in a way, could be said to have started or at least promoted gallery viewing of art. Because when they built the Jaffet Library, they had a built-in art gallery in there, in the lower floor. It was a space between the reading room and the periodicals room, and it had lovely fixtures that could be adapted to show paintings or even sculptures, small sculptures. And it was in this place where the students would go and frequent just as they were trying to do their library work. And so it received a lot of attention from students who had to pass through it. When it was opened, AUB was proud of it. They invited society in, and who came to the opening? Zalfa Shab'oun. And she was shown the collection of the works that AUB had. AUB has quite a collection, of its permanent collection. So the art department would mount exhibitions there every year of the students' work, but then they would invite various foreign artists to come. The art scene was in a big time of change because before the art department started, at that time you had the change from representational art that had been going on in Lebanon for several hundred years, which meant the pictures had to represent something real. They could be religious. You had much religious painting, saints, of course, Jesus, the church things. Then at that time, just before Marriott Charlton came in, society painting started happening. Khalil Salibi was probably the most important representative of that. He painted many pictures of the high society. And he was an interesting man. He had been trained in Paris, and he happened to rub shoulders and become friends with John Singer Sargent and the Impressionists. And so he brought knowledge of Impressionism back to Lebanon with him. If you look at the brushstrokes of Khalil Salibi, you'll find great artistic excellence there, great virtuosity that is very much like what John Singer Sargent does and is praised for. Well, others can do it. He did it. Very, very fine work. And Georges Sire came along at that time. They painted in the Impressionism, and while they were doing that, they were thought to be at the foremost of modern art. But then here came Marriott Charlton, Margot Hoffman, and they started getting far more advanced, not just advanced, experimental. Some critics and historians like to set up a sort of a rivalry between the French side of town and the Saint-Joseph crowd and the AUB crowd as though there was rivalry. I think that's misleading because there was enough interchange between them so that they knew each other. Of course, there was such a thing as the French idiom and what was going on in the West and mostly in America, Chicago, and New York especially, of course. But there was also enough friendly exchange so that I would not say that people had hard feelings towards each other. They enjoyed seeing what was going on. Lebanon suddenly, by being exposed to the two currents, and then this current over here, the American current, had a lot of experimentation going on. Suddenly, the art in Lebanon became pluralistic. You had many different styles going on. At this time, you could find friendly exchange between the other institutions and AUB, the other places that taught art in Lebanon, most notably ALBA, the Académie Libanaise des Beaux-Arts, and also the BCW, Beirut College for Women, which later was renamed to be LAU, Lebanese American University. They had an art department. Their art department was not so different from the AUB art department because it was one of Marriott Charlton's chief students that became the head of that department. Her name was Meragiz Irani. The scene outside of AUB was really interesting. You had George Zahanni and his little pub called the Smuggler's Inn just on Makhul Street, just a few meters away from the main gate, AUB main gate. And he would promote art. He even organized, in the middle of the Civil War, a Makhul festival, street art exhibition, which was very extensive and very cosmopolitan. Anybody was allowed to show. Now, actually, he was not the first. The first such exhibition was mounted in 1968. It was called Open Air Art, and it was spearheaded by James Sullivan, who was the head of the art section of IC. And it was mounted on the IC steps, which were a long flight of steps between AUB and between IC. It was very democratic. He and the committee, and I was on the committee, by the way, simply wanted everybody who wanted to create art to be able to put it up. Also, what was going on at that time? Well, you did have Dar al-Fan going on, which was a showcase for art, but also some theater, sketches, music, things like that. That was run mostly by Janine Erbeiz, who later on opened a gallery that is now the gallery that's named after her. You had the Horseshoe Restaurant, which was on Hamra Street next to the Hamra Theater. And that became known as the place for artists to meet. They would sit and talk art. They would sit on chairs like this. There. This, I'm told, is one of the horseshoe chairs. So I feel quite part of the Lebanese historical art scene by sitting here on this chair and speaking to you about it. But it was a popular place for the non-AUB artists to meet and talk about what should art be. The Sursut Museum suddenly was given over to art. This was considered a very great gift from the Sursut family. And who did they ask to be the president of the jury that would judge and organize one of the Salon d'Automne? Arthur Frick. You see, Frick himself was a commanding presence, and he had sort of an easy seniority about him. And so he was just sort of a natural choice to be an expert, to be a reference and a consultant. And they also asked him to just, preside over how to do the whole business of a democratic exhibition like Salon d'Automne. And they tried their very best to invite really successful artists who would have a good showing to educate, to enlighten the Lebanese public. AUB had another very interesting effect on the society, and that was dance. In 1949, my mother, who had been trained in dance and physical education in both America and in Denmark, got together with another American lady. Her name was Melda Wallace, who also was a very good folk dance expert. They organized a few parties for people they knew, friends, to dance folk dances, and they had such fun that Melda Wallace said to my mother, "Esther, wouldn't it be nice if we had a folk dance festival here and let everybody join? Or how could we organize it?" And my mother said, "Well, AUB is the perfect place, the athletic field there." So with the help of my father, who had been the first registrar, and also he was influential on the campus, they organized the first AUB Folk Dance Festival. They invited as many schools as they could contact to participate, and then on the big day, they would have the Folk Dance Festival, and all the schools, the students would come dressed in costumes from different countries because they were doing folk dances from different countries. You had one school representing American Folk Dance Festival, others representing Armenian, others Mexican, others Italian, French, etc. So you had a rich variety, but always the place of honor was saved for the Lebanese Dabki. They were at the end. Everybody rejoiced. And they used, the older songs, Alloma, Alloma, and Ahya Zain, and then later on, Shatti Yadini.
شتي يا دنيا تيزيد موسمنا ويحلى وتدفق مي وزرع جديد بحقلتنا يعلم شدي يا دنيا يزيد موسمنا ويحلى تدفق مي وزرع جديد بحقلتنا يعلم.
I remember very well because my mother was on the organizing committee and she was on the committee for many, many years. Well, you can be sure that I was drafted to dance in the festival. So I knew it very well. But why is that important? Well, first of all, the impact was great. It was the biggest event on AUB campus, even bigger than the commencement, and even bigger than the athletics day. But the other side of this was that the Baalbek festival, when it started, they could see the value of having folk dancing, especially in the operas, the Rahbani offerings with either Fairuz or Sabah being the star of the show, and Nasri Shamsuddin and some of the others. So AUB was in touch with some people in America, and they got a man called Bert Stimmel. I knew him well, actually. He coached me in some things. Bert Stimmel was a professional theater man and choreographer, and he came over specifically to choreograph all the dances, not just the dabkis, but the other dances as well, for the Rahbani operas. And how did he do it? He worked with the troupe, which later on became the Caracal Company, yes. So this is one way in which AUB did influence what the later developments in the Baalbek Festival. We also started a theater company called Beritas, which performed both in AUB and outside AUB using professional and semi-professional actors. We did a lot of Shakespeare productions, but we did a lot of also experimental Brecht productions and other experimental things. I remember I played the husband of Valerie Sarrouf in a production in the Phoenicia Hotel Theatre of Ibsen's Hedda Gabler. We put on very, very big productions outdoors. If I may say so, I was the director of the largest production of Shakespeare that we did, As You Like It, with 50 actors and a dog. Later on, during the war, or at the end of the war, we put on 2 more Shakespeare productions. They were directed by a good friend of mine, Peter Speyer, of Twelfth Night and then Midsummer Night's Dream in the Green Oval, incredibly popular. Many people came. One British critic said it was the best production that he had seen of Midsummer Night's Dream. The school started busing students in. They would sit on the grass, and the audiences became bigger and bigger every night. The AUB artists would socialize in the milk bar, or they would go out and sketch in the open air, because AUB has one of the prettiest campuses in the world. And they have such things as the banyan trees. You see, the AUB had the first banyan trees ever in this part of the world. One of the American professors, almost 100 years ago, came to AUB by ship from California across the Pacific, saw in India banyan trees, and thought we should have them in AUB. So he bought 10 pots with little banyan trees, and on the ship in a storm, 5 of them were destroyed, but 5 lived, and they were planted in AUB, and there now they stand. And now some other places have banyan trees. They got them from starts in the AUB, and I happen to love them. There's one of my banyan paintings there. They are wonderful for drawing classes, because they have these roots and trunks that go up and down with swells and curves that look like the human body. And so I used to take my drawing class out there and make them draw the banyan trees and show them how close it was to human figures. It was something like a life drawing class. My artwork is a little bit controversial because it's not controversial. I have created some works that are really experimental, but people don't think that of my artwork because I do paint realistically or like scenes that should be at the back of a stage because of my theater background. Up till some years ago, I was mostly known for watercolor landscapes of Lebanon because I happen to love the landscapes of Lebanon and because I was pretty good in watercolors. My main aim in all my art, theater as well, is I would very, very much like my art, or people seeing something that I do, to walk away happy, or at least a little bit elevated, edified. I badly want that. I like to celebrate God's creation. I believe that there is a God. I believe He's created all to begin with. And so often I pray before I begin to paint. And I hope that there is some spiritual content in what I do. You can insert that in somewhere.